welcome to Liminal Light, a show that explores the languages of myth and star, earth, sky, tongue, and spirit through weekly astrological forecasts. I'm your host, Chris. Enjoy. The series of zeros and ones that represent us, the program of our every chromosome, of our every protein, the poise of our intentions, the impetus to all our actions, like snakes darting out of the dark, ones snapping out of the centers of zeros into the sequence which connects and completes us. A catalyst in the chain instigates us to step from our caves, and as now Mercury is free of the retrograde shadow, we progress forward into new logic, new sequences of action, new ideas firing off, new impulses igniting. We are what we do in Aries, or with Mercury in Aries, we say we are what we think we do, or we think we are what we say we do. If we could slow down reality and replay it, we might find a version of ourselves programming our moves before we make them, the synaptic spark, the instinctual action that has us hustle into posture, or run towards targets. As Mercury proceeds into the third decan of Aries, our mercurial faculties grow craftier and flashier, blunt and gaudy but picked out precisely for effect and to draw attention. The trickster's pied costume in loud and clashing colors that get attention and draw to his dance. One carries a message loud and clear, but also carries a sucker punch, a jab that wakes up the audience like a sharp whistle or the firing of a pistol, and then makes them witness to a spirited spray of language and motion. And if this doesn't get their chest thumping, his tongue will wrap around their hearts like a serpent and pump it for them. Neon letters erupting into vain and combative sentences that rouse the spirits of whose ears or eyes they fall upon. These are new and original ideas, even dangerous ideas, or at least naive and full of energy, brash slogans and rushed manifestos, passed in pogo packs with bold-typed phrases to latch onto fist-pumping chants. Logic, ideas, words, hearts, tongues, fists, all in a chain reaction. Although hold on, wait a minute. That's all well and good for thoughts and speech, but feet on the ground in the pace of life in the hazy fields of languid luncheons and slow and steady labor pulls the reins in on the lip service. Somehow all these new ideas and crafty logic need to be paced so that they drizzle evenly into the gears of attention and time, so that they make sense and don't sound like squirrel chatter or high-pitched peeper chirping. Releasing speech in a way that is soothing to the steady sun traversing Taurus and in accordance with strict Saturn's slow steps from station in Capricorn, or else to be more susceptible to what you say falling as a clamorous clash. The sun sextiles Neptune at 9 a.m., coloring the day with the collaboration between our organic visions, how we steadily step towards attaining them in our intuitions, our psychic connections to the wholeness or ambient totality of the universe. We may be inspired to pause in our work and contemplate over the needs of others, taking a moment to put some prayer into our practice and petition, saints, etc., to aid those in crisis, or consider how a cut of our harvest might go to charity, even if it is a division of our labor or simply spiritual petition. Venus coming to square Neptune over Arcanar at 6 p.m. may dedicate Monday to daydreaming and romantic imagination. This sounds lovely in theory, but if you are scheduled to require focus or discipline, distractions by daydreams and artistic inspiration can imbue circumstances instead with turbulence, especially in relationships arising out of fantasies and delusions. You might become preoccupied with an imaginary crisis that doesn't read as whimsical and charming when it is you swinging your sword at the windmill, or even Rabelaisian-level escapades that detoured the day away. Chatty, journalistic, curious, idea-loving Venus in tension against the imaginative dreams and psychic experiences of the ambient universe, where vibes and creative conversation clash for better or worse. On Tuesday, May 8th, the morning begins with Venus passing over Rigel around 10 a.m. which directs our aesthetic attentions towards education of the masses from creative ideas and media arts. This is not necessarily an act of softening our focus to make it fit for mass consumption, but having no regard for social conventions, ethical considerations, or religious sensitivity. Instead, this is art being art in a way that makes society look at issues how they really are, in a way that sometimes journalism or media might not be able to acceptably present. A son who has just recently learned to work hand in hand with cosmic intuition and psychic phenomenon in the most organic and grounded way, then sights across the ecliptic and comes face to face with the planet of optimistic outlooks at 8:30 p.m. as the sun opposes Jupiter. We receive a vision of steady, organic process and fully coherent of intense emotional alchemy. Plotting progress need to be put in balance with philosophies of primal hungers and an understanding of how they are sublimated, how the poisons we hold within can be filtered and transformed into medicinal potions that are not only suitable for everyday use, but are beneficial to how we sow. How can our most dangerous desires be diluted by giving them expression daily in gradual holistic doses? The combination of this day's aspects culminates in an interesting interplay of dynamics. How can our inner darkness be brought out into the open in a way that it is free to express, but no longer weaponized? And how can the masses become better informed by this collective experience? If we all bring a digestible dose of our intensity to the surface in our continual actions, do we encourage the blossoming of a more balanced and well-informed culture? Or at least a more creatively varied or aesthetically stimulating one? And how is this done? Art may be the only answer. On Thursday, May 10th, as the sun progresses into the third decan of Taurus and continues to the third phase of the Earth sign agrarian metaphor, our solar eye looks directly toward the possibility of agricultural disaster. Catastrophic crop failure is always a possibility in a mass planting. While waiting for crops to mature into harvest, there is always the chance of hazard interfering, such as hail, blight, drought, or pests. Here then is a form of humility, patience, phylactery, charm, and apotropaism, essentially the dynamic of myriad fertility rites practiced by all spectrums of culture to assure bountiful returns and to sustain the lives of those who work and hopefully live in harmony with the land. This may be accomplished by any rite out of folk history, any talisman, amulet, sacrifice, dance, or custom, from the simple to the elaborate, and from the wholesome or gentle to the gruesome and terrible, such as the cinematic conclusion of the Wicker Man sacrifice. At this phase of the spring, our hopes have been made manifest, and tools have touched the earth. Our spells have set sail, and there is no turning back the seasonal clock to catch up with what we might have missed or ran out of time for. The waves of yellow and purple and white flowers tell us how far along we are in the sequence, and for many things we must keep our fingers crossed as much as we keep our eyes peeled and our hands busy, helping our yields along to realization. Very early, only technically Friday, May 11th, Venus follows the trend of entering into the third decans by proceeding into Gemini's third phase, where opposites migrate even further to the extreme ends of the spectrum, and choices between diverging elements in the realm of Venusian affairs must be made. Suddenly we look over the polarization of creativity, art, pleasure, aesthetic, sex, love, relationships, and we realize we must make decisions between A and Z, between alpha and omega, that ultimately opposites of this sort, though they attract, cannot be combined, and in the end there can only be one. This especially applies to cultural, social, and mental intellectual channels, as this is Gemini, an air sign. The universe, or nature itself, beyond the customs of the cultures within it, occasionally only allow one thing to happen at a time, and the tension between pairs is too great for steady, ongoing merger. You cannot look to the right and to the left simultaneously. You cannot monitor the north and the south simultaneously. And if you are going to make sense out of what the wind carries, you must decide which cardinal direction you give your attention. Again, this is Venus, and so this has obvious implications romantically, but creatively, art might be the only medium that can express this tension, like a surfer trying to hold onto the swelling paradox as it crashes. Ultimately, even here, will you be able to best capture the essence in film, painting, in poetry, in documentary, in fiction? Amalgamation has taken you so far, and as the road before you forks, you must decide which path you must now take. Aesthetically, the stang rises before us in the road, and it becomes a place to petition and pray to fates in other ways. We might consider what idols belong at such a place, and what performances accompany such frenetic narratives. When stories divide the page and text funnels down two drains, the strings of sounds decreasing by one letter at a time in parallel until they're gone, and then what? Then where did the spirits of this place go, and what are they up to if the song has simplified until it stops? Now what? Again we must choose, once more, sit in silence or start all over again and repeat the sequence. There are times where either is required, but you can't do both, at least not at once. But if you could. Later that morning by 11 a.m., the moon conjoins Chiron, creating an opportunity to feel what the wounded healer, newly in Aries, is wounding or able to heal. We might not want to concentrate too much energy here, but as she passes by the centaur, we might keep ourselves observant and see if we can't get a whiff of the medicine the old one carries. Later that evening at 7:15, the sun trines Pluto, where we might spelunk with headlamps into our absolute depths to inform us of our volitional actions. What are we doing? What should we do? Perhaps the obsidian mirror can guide us, especially when it is our own entrails in the reflection for us to paw through. But the darkness is too thick, our lantern won't cut it, and we might as well abandon it and go blind. Search in a more subtle way. Look with our eyes closed. Do some kind of deep investigation and study, seeking intense initiatory experiences to attain realization and vitalization. Enact raw power to harness forcefulness. Vision and identification with organic, steady pace, and preparing rites of fertility protection harmonized with voids and beyond or raw mysterious powers, and the structure of how concrete reality and nature, or hierarchical systems, ultimately operate. Really, what we look for is a sound. All we need to do is find the harmonic, the piece that resonates with our reflections as well as our shadows. Saturday, May 12th opens with another potential clang as Mercury squares Mars at 9:30 a.m. All communications are likely to become both combative and challenging here, and it's likely you might be telling people off who cross you, or simply, or not so simply, having to defend your ideas and beliefs. We must be careful today as driving and traveling can be rather dangerous. This is not necessarily from ill fortune, but because repressed rage weaponizes communications. Logic and travel affecting our abilities to think, speak, and drive. The inspirational performance which communicates individual ideas clashing against calculated strategic managerial actions. Really, it is about energization, that Mercury has to contend with agendas when he really wants to shout slogans. He wants to do his own rendition of crass, but there is a sequence of maneuvers that must be completed for him to be free enough to evoke anarchy. The tensions of squares is what stimulates action and causes stuff to happen. You leave the patio and go inside because the mosquitoes are getting bad, quite simply. You fix the car because it is broken down. You do something about it. This is the same, and as long as there are positive and productive channels for the expression to flow into, it might be one of those times where you kick ass. Keep on the lookout for these channels during the week leading up to Saturday, as Mars is in Saturn's sign, and this is Saturn's day, and the night is Mercury's night, and Mercury is in a Mars-ruled sign, so he is not likely to get ignored or shoved into the background. Mars will want to direct Mercury, so this is for the better, rather than them having opposing objectives altogether. Make it a call to action, and use your brain and voice. Inspire yourself and others to manage the affairs at hand, like the work chants that get you through a hard day of labor. At 4 p.m., Venus visits the fixed star Bellatrix, and creative relationship, artistic, sexual success becomes at the expense of facing various shadow side issues in the process. You may become or encounter a romantically rogue character or creative person clearly on an alternative path, highlighting non-conventional relationships and controversial social circumstances. A few hours later, Mars comes to Acumen at 10 p.m., a star in the tail of Scorpio, which brings the feeling of being under attack to the mixture, which could stir up the motivation to act in the face of hardship or despite social negativity. This star also stimulates interaction with the shadow side of things, but through meeting stimulating challenges. Saturday indeed has potential for drama and conflict, but perhaps conflicts that lead to success by passing through darkness or rousing the resources of your shadow self to the occasion. As aspects and transits go, these can manifest as messy social dramas, actual all-out wars, devious desserts at dinner, or the themes you encounter in a movie. Don't lock yourself in a bunker, although alternately avoid obvious aggressive escalations, or be totally prepared to tango. This is stressed as the Moon and Mercury will both conjoin Uranus by 7 a.m. Sunday morning, and will be absolutely applying overnight. This can be a very vigorous influx of new ideas that ripple through you emotionally. If you are not normally set to quick thinking, this can potentially blow you back where you open the box. And if you are mentally speedy normally, you might course with inspiration and excitement. Both possibilities have the potential of a system overload, as keeping pace will prove harder than it seems, especially as time and vision itself is rolling along much more slowly. We might want to prepare for Saturday and Sunday as one does for a rowdy concert or a roller coaster or a frenetic festival. Don't dread it. It probably won't kill you, but still gear up and embrace for impact. Welcome back, Bonnie.
Good afternoon. Happy Sunday, everyone.
Yeah, it's always odd because we don't record on Sundays, so it's the time skip, being like projecting the consciousness of Sunday from Thursday. Trying to feel
wishing
like
it was
Sunday.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're wearing our Sunday best. We're trying to get in the mood.
Yeah. So, I know that there's things happening today, but I'm excited, of course, about talking about tomorrow night, where we have this at 6 o'clock, the Venus square Neptune configuration, and it's the evening of the Met Gala. So the theme is Heavenly Bodies, Fashion in the Catholic Imagination. It includes 50 pieces on loan from the Sistine Chapel sacristy, obviously approved by the Vatican. It takes place in 2 galleries as well as at the cloisters, and although it seemed that perhaps they had astrologers helping to plan this event, it's actually always on the first Monday of May.
Yeah, there's not a lot happening at the beginning of the week. I mean, of course, there still is stuff happening, but there's no like really tumultuous big aspect, like we just had in the past weeks, like Saturn station and Pluto station, and Mars can join Pluto. So this is like a lot easier of a week, even though there are things happening. And then one of this, I think the only square aspect in the first end of the week is this Venus square Neptune. And so, as Bonnie's saying, it's perfect day for such an art event of such a scale, and that it's like the romantic imagination being triggered and daydreaming and being distracted by daydreams and artistic inspiration is good for people who are going to go to the opening. That's like the right place to be. Like, it's kind of like if you're going to because like I said in the forecast, this could be a distracting aspect. Like, it sounds great, but if you're if you have to be at work on Monday or do something serious, that being stuck in this like daydreaming mode is definitely going to get in the way. So especially because it's on the fixed star Akanar, which has it's like the constellation of, you know, the river that runs through the sky, and like where it's like the flood and the crisis of the flood and things being washed away downstream. And so it's like the Venus there, you know, Akanar is on or near the degree that Neptune's at, and then Venus is squaring that degree. So it gets this like there's this turbulence, kind of like crisis, like kind of tension mixed in with like the fantasies and illusions, you know. And in Gemini, Venus is very chatty and journalistic and curious and idea loving, and so it's like a perfect vibe for that show, you know.
It will be attended mostly by celebrities and people directly related to the fashion world, and of course there'll just be tons of paparazzi there taking images of all of the clothes. I'm excited to just see what the clothes are.
I'm wondering what the crisis aspect of it is, you know.
Well,
I mean, it
might have nothing to do with that evening. I mean, there is like an interesting kind of fashion and Catholicism mixed together. There, it's almost like a crisis there.
Yeah, it is a crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like,
it's, you know, just
Catholicism is a religion of a state of crisis in a sense, you know. And then, so that's really interesting. And then the next day, in the evening, we have the sun opposite Jupiter, which is like a very optimistic outlook, kind of, you know, it's generally just going to come up as like a feeling good day where everything looks great, the outlook looks great, you know, but it can be prone to over optimism, I guess, is the only problem with it. And I guess that's why we're saying, you know, this week there's not like these tensions that are, you know, the problems that come up in the week are like, you might be too optimistic, you might daydream a lot, you know. They're not like these bigger problems, but which is an interesting aspect of, even when I'm reading for people, I'll get these, if I'm seeing a lot of transits coming up that are mostly positive, there's just not as much to say, you know. But when there's the transits are negative or possibly negative, you know, are tricky or dangerous, we go into like such detail trying to describe them to people, and people want that detail. If you tell someone like, oh, something bad is going to happen, you're like, what's going to happen?
Yeah,
you know?
tell me.
Yeah, tell me like exactly what it is. Where if you're like, oh, something good is going to happen, you're not like, describe it in detail. Where exactly is this good thing going to be? You know,
what should I wear?
Yeah, and sometimes that is helpful to like locate the boon, you know, so you can like grab it and make the most of it. But a lot of times, especially with Venus stuff, it's just going to be nice. With Jupiter stuff, it's more like an opportunity that you're going to want to seize, because the opportunity could arise and you could do nothing about it, and then just miss it. Where it's nice to get the opportunity, you're like, oh, can you believe this guy offered me a job? And that feels great that day. But unless you take the job and do the job, then you don't actually benefit from that opportunity.
I also like thinking of Jupiter closely tied with religion, organized religion.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a very good point. Like that. Yeah, and so that's like maybe another aspect of that Met Gala. You know, that like we get the Venus Neptune square, and then we get like the Jupiter opposition. Definitely, yeah, organized religion for sure. And then the thing about when the sun is opposite the Jupiter, just as far as like how the synodic cycle goes, is that's the sun opposes Jupiter in the very middle of Jupiter's retrograde cycle. So that's kind of like that's what this event is marking, you know, that Jupiter went retrograde in March, and Jupiter is usually retrograde for about 4 months every year. And so we're 2 months in, we're halfway through Jupiter's retrograde cycle, which in previous shows we talked about how like Jupiter brings opportunities, and growth. But when Jupiter's retrograde, it's more like trying to make sure that you understand everything you've grown into over the time where Jupiter's been direct since the Sun Jupiter conjunction to the retrograde. You grow, and then you're like, okay, do I understand all these pieces? Do I have this down? And that's the time where it's more about Jupiter's wisdom significations. And then right when you're at this opposition is an interesting point where sometimes you'll get externalizing sagacity, where you're like, it's them that are wise, not I, or am I wise, or are other people the ones that are wise, or who is it that has the wisdom, and how do I get that wisdom?
Seeking of that, yeah.
Yeah, and often it's teachers can step in at that moment, or they become prominent, or someone
your teacher appears, or sort of it becomes clear who your teacher could be. Yeah,
or at least some you're paying them a lot of attention, or even reading a piece of philosophy just suddenly is really hits you. So it's often it's the middle of the process of trying to understand if you have wisdom of everything that is available to you. And so you're kind of looking to well, who has the wisdom, and then getting that information for yourself.
Yeah.
But it's really a process of trying to internalize it, and not psychologically project, the tension between ideals and beliefs and self-image. Which, I don't know, I've already felt that coming up a bit in certain things I've been looking at, reading discourses, recently transcriptions of talks that just happened, and then being oh, that's really interesting stuff. I haven't thought about that for a long time, but that was kind of the material I was reading, 10 years ago, and be do I really want to go back to that material? Is that me? Or is that is
that relevant anymore?
Yeah, or is that the person that I thought has the wisdom is now talking about wisdom that I already had, or at least I thought I had, and then you're oh wait, but do I have to listen to this all over again? It's just a weird example, but it's the interplay of is the wisdom in you or outside of you,
Yeah.
So yeah, that's something to look for over that course of the week, and just kind of ponder. But we were saying, it's not going to cause you to do anything insane,
I like thinking about this Wicker Man aspect with the sun into Taurus, going to Taurus 3.
Yeah, the third decan of Taurus. Yeah, having because it's an agrarian metaphor, so you get the section of the agrarian metaphor that Taurus is about is the sowing and the plowing and preparation of the field, so that you can sow and plant your seeds, and then your crops begin to grow, and then it's kind of just reliant on fertility itself. And so the middle to the end of Taurus becomes very much you see a lot of that all of the in every culture's folk history, you see fertility rites and protection of the crops, and it goes from the please make the crops grow and please make things fertile to please protect the crops and make sure that a storm doesn't wipe them out,
because they're in sort of a delicate state at this point of the growing season.
Yeah, things have begun, and then it's kind of out of your hands at that point, and they're just
they're more vulnerable.
And then we get a lot of apotropaic traditions and making, warding away stuff like talismans, protective talismans, things like that.
Yeah.
And I can already see that coming on, just personally, watching interests kind of migrate towards more protective magic, it's very appropriate for the season. And that's kind of interesting in conjunction with Chiron and Aries, and wondering what exactly that's going to do, because we're not really we're not really sure, like Chiron, it's not like, as far as I can tell, it does something really on a natal level. It seems to do something really different on everyone's chart. It's not like, oh, this configuration Chiron, there you go, like, and I can kind of like predict it to you. It's always something that's like manifests as something that people are like kind of tripping about, that something that they always had a problem with, like they approach this one thing and just kind of like shrink away from it instead of deal with it. And that as soon as you deal with it, it kind of just goes away. You're like, oh, I don't know why I was tripping about that for so long.
Yeah.
But that's natally. But you're like, well, what about mundane astrology? Like, how does it affect the world when it goes through these cycles? And I haven't, there's probably something out there that I'd love to be pointed to. And I'll probably ask people when I'm at UAC, the United Astrology Conference, like in Chicago in a couple weeks from now, literature to point towards for like good information on this. But it's not like the other outer planets, or especially the inner planets, where you're like, oh yeah, when this planet was in this sign, it did this, or blah, blah, blah. The little reading I've done about it, I haven't, the research seems to be there. Like people are like, oh yeah, look at all the dates. And then they say, well, this happened during this period, this happened during this period, but they don't like match up, like one person's research says like, oh, it has this like, kind of like LGBTQ like cycle to it, and then other people are like, oh, it's about like tribal style, or like body mods, or like warriors, like I guess in like, well, the years are like Chiron was in Aries in 1968 to 1977. And before that, 1918 to 1927. Before that, 1868 to 1878. And before that, 1820 to 1829. And I don't have notes for before that in front of me, but you kind of see the pattern. It's like almost like these two chunks, and then you can move them 100 years back, And right away when I looked at it, I was like, oh, 68 to 77, then 1918 to 1927, you get like that late 60s, early 70s culture in America, like...
Great music.
Yeah, totally. Like great music and film era, like very artistic, but it's kind of like the second part of the 60s and then most of the 70s, which is, there's like a lot more experimentation and literacy and breaking from norms and a lot more tension. It wasn't like it's kind of darker than just like the free love message of the first part of the 60s. And then you get the same thing like in 1918 to 1927, like World War I coming to an end, and then the kind of artistic and sexual liberation of like the Roaring 20s, they're kind of similar. And then I haven't gone back to look deeper into the 1868 and 1878. Something I'll probably take up and do some research on.
Maybe write an article.
But I know that in the 1918 to 1927 period is when Japan abolished the samurai class.
Wow.
So you definitely get people like talking about like, oh, this is like, and then from 68 to 77 you get a lot of people like dying in rock and roll who were like the warriors of the 60s, like Hendrix and Joplin and like, all those deaths that we got.
Oh yeah.
So people like say like, oh yeah, maybe it's this, what happens when we lose our warriors, and what do we do when like our sense of warriors is wounded, and then also like, it's about, Aries is about like initiating things and starting new patterns and being assertive and being confident. And that's like, that in a sense is like, that's where the problem is, or that's where the woundedness is. And clearly right now there's, just with like the digital world, there's an obvious like problem of like, well, what is the individual anymore?
Yeah.
Like, is the individual what you say you are, or is the individual like what you do?
That troll on the internet?
Yeah.
Is that who you identify with?
So it's weird, things get like, yeah. So it's weird. Things are getting much more individualized, but like homogenized simultaneously. So that's kind of like and right now we kind of are looking at that. We're like, ooh, that's kind of ugly. What are we going to do about that? And that's already kind of like an expression of Chiron and Aries, just kind of looking at a wound and being like, oh God, and then maybe kind of turning away from it, being like, I don't really know what to do about that right now. But then as the 7 or, the 8 or 9 years goes on, being like, wow, that wound's gotten really bad. I don't know how we're going to heal that,
Festering.
Yeah.
Seems like the other major thing that's happening really begins on the weekend. I know that I was listening to the astrology podcast last night, and those 3 lovely people were talking about how really May is kind of mellow until this coming weekend.
Yeah, which is true, but the thing that I'm really curious about is when there's not a lot happening, do the stars get to speak louder? When
I love that, Chrissy. When
the planets aren't in loud conflict, like, do we get to look at when, like, on when Achernar, is on Neptune, when Venus squares that on the 7th, is Achernar going to really speak? Like when
Venus on Bellatrix?
Yeah, like first Venus on Rigel at 10 a.m. on Tuesday. Is that going to really speak? And I always watch these, and I do see the stars come through, that their energy and their communication really comes out in the forecast, because it is really the stars that make up the zodiac. Like, it's like, if you look at the significations, especially when you look at the decans, you're like, what's this decan about? And then the collection of stars that are rooted in it really give it its character. We don't have like the zodiacal system and like the concentration on like the 7 planets until the Hellenic era, and like the astrology that was developed in Babylon, and earlier in like Egypt and Sumeria before that, which like goes into the vanishing point of history. It's all stars. It's all stellar astrology and omenology. And so they got incorporated into what we know as the zodiac, and now we just think of astrology as like the sun, the moon, Venus, like Taurus, Gemini, Libra, etc.
Yeah.
And the stars are just embedded in there. But,
yeah.
When there's not this planetary tension,
the wind beneath their wings.
Yeah, totally. When there's not this planetary tension for us to focus on, I really wonder if the star character is just going to come out even more, And so, as Bonnie said, then we get, right as we move into the weekend, we get the Mercury Mars square, and that's right away clamorous, So that's like the first thing that we're probably going to wake up to and say like, oh my, like there's a problem, or it's kind of a nasty little one, just because it's whenever Mercury gets like really turbulent, it people really take notice, like when you start getting in traffic jams, you're getting in fights with people,
you drop your phone in the toilet,
like your devices aren't working, or they're breaking. It really affects the way you go through your day,
it inhibits your communication, or potentially. But you said the notes you wrote that all communications are combative and challenging. Which is inhibitive too, if that's the way you're approaching things.
Which is, it's like, to get through it is going to be probably about like finding a way to have channels for that tension, because it's the squares that do stuff. I mentioned in the forecast that like when you're like hanging out outside on the porch or something, and then you're like, oh my God, the bugs are getting really bad, let's go inside. That it's that irritation that causes that motion, like you're in stasis in one area, and because you become irritated, you're forced to action, to move and do something about it. Like I mentioned, like your car's broken down, so take it to the mechanic, you know, like you don't just take it to the mechanic because there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
And so it's this like this Mercury Mars square, these squares that we get is what causes us to do something about something, you know? And so they can be very active. Like people with like a lot of squares in their charts, you're like, oh, this person must be angry or you know, have be irritated, have like, you know, it's living a life of irritation, but it might just be that they're really productive, you know, that there's a fire under them to do stuff, you know, where someone with a lot of sextiles or trines might just feel really mellow all the time, you know? And so as long as you have something to do with this Mercury Mars square, somewhere to put it, that's always the thing with Mars, is like have a place to put the energy.
Absolutely.
So it's going to
start stacking that wood.
Yeah. Well, with Mercury square Mars, it's like Mercury's wanting to like really, I mean, it's Mercury in Aries, right? It's going to want to talk about itself. It's going to want to like get kind of slogany and shout stuff out and like talk about new ideas as new impulsive ideas, you know?
Yeah.
And confrontational ideas and have confidence behind its thinking. But Mars is like thinking about like managerial action, you know, like kind of like we're going to move this piece over here, we're going to move that over there, very strategic. And so them being like square to each other, that those agendas are clashing, you know, that Mercury might want to say all these things and get kind of exuberant and perform its own thinking. But Mars's kind of obstacle course is in the way. So you're like, yeah, you can do that, but after you get through all this stuff. You know? And so that's the day that Venus reaches Bellatrix. And so both Venus on Bellatrix and then I believe we have, is it Mars on Acumen?
Oh yeah, Mars on Acumen.
Both of those things have like a kind of like shadow side element, which is interesting when you get two stars at once in different signs in different parts of the zodiac, being like, oh yeah, this like Mars on Acumen will like rise to challenges and be like into doing things that are challenging and like kind of go through these levels of confidence and face the shadow side of life when they do it. Like, you know, like that sounds really difficult and dark. I'm all about it. That's like kind of what I'm salivating for right now.
Yeah.
And Venus on Bellatrix is like, you know, like we can, there's like a rogue character, you know, like, which is interesting aspect, right? That like Venus in Gemini is very chatty and it's like very social and like journalistic, and that there's this like rogue element, this like kind of non-conventional person just kind of rushes in, and there's maybe some like romance surrounding them.
It sounds romantic and fun.
Yeah, and that like success can come out of it, but there's like it faces something like that you're like, oh, that worked, but you kind of have to like, you end up in kind of the shadow side of things, like to kind of get to that success. So it's kind of weird that it comes up twice on this kind of heavy squaring day. And then the next morning, which is into next Sunday, you get the Mercury and Moon and Uranus all conjunct. And that's when you get like a real system overload, just a lot of like a big influx of ideas. And Uranus gets to really express. He gets to speak through Mercury and gets to like, you get to feel Uranus through the moon. And that is kind of like the Saturday, Sunday that then lead right into Uranus changing signs not long after. And so that's kind of like the pistol really like fires at 9:30 a.m. with that Mercury Mars square, and then there's kind of like no turning around until after the ingress.
Right, and you were talking about that as like astrologers are really looking at that because there might be some cues or the beginning of patterns which will stay with us for how long? Is it 7 years?
Well, 7 years for Uranus, and then like from
5 months for
5 months for Mars and the first decan of Aquarius. So yeah, like several weeks ago, if anyone was listening, we talked about Mars and Capricorn and what Mars and Capricorn is going to do with Pluto there and with Saturn there. And then we saw like the instant Mars entered Capricorn, there was that, what do you call it? Those like self-driving cars, you know, and then that death in Tempe, Arizona.
Right.
That was the first one in America, which I didn't see how many there were in other countries, but all the articles said that was just like, well, this is the first one in America.
Yeah.
Like, neglecting to say like how many have actually happened, you know?
Right.
And then there was that Mars conference a couple days later in the owner of Amazon put on, and then so it was like clearly, and then all the gun control stuff was like really huge in the news at that point. So right away you saw like, okay, this is about like automation and how robots kill things. Robots can kill people.
Potential is there. Yeah. And
so that's that story. So the same thing will happen with like Mars ingresses into Aquarius pretty much simultaneously as Uranus ingresses into Taurus, and they square because it happens at the same time. Mars kind of catches up and squares Taurus.
So amazing. And
so you'll see significations of both things right away. Things that we're going to live with for a long time. You're like, oh, what's that about? You know? And you're like, okay, now they get to like really express right off the bat. And it's right after this kind of drum roll of other difficult aspects with Mercury conjoining Uranus, and kind of it's like the famous last words, you know, in Taurus, and then the crossover, and then the square. So it's definitely like there's some turbulence. I know I'll be flying at the time, and then just thinking about that, like, sounds like a bad time to fly, but just
it's not a bad time for travel. It's just.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily. I mean, I wouldn't suggest it. You know, like if I had a client, they said like, when should I travel? I wouldn't be like, oh, well, right here when all these hard aspects happen. You know,
it's an interesting oversight for an astrologer.
Well, it's just because of the United Astrology Conference.
I know.
Yeah,
I'm joking.
Which seems like kind of almost scheduled for the Mars ingress. You know that, and I know at least
wasn't there some fantastic aspect happening during that time too? I thought that there was. I can't remember what it is now. I mean,
I'll have to go back and look.
Yeah.
But modern astrologers talk about astrology itself being related to Uranus. You know, it's not obviously in the traditional literature, but that, you know, that this Uranus ingress, and then you have this huge astrology conference. There's like 2,000 astrologers in attendance and 18 talks going on at a time, every hour for 6 days, you know. So anyway, what I was trying to say is that like just the act of flying is a pretty big turbulent shift, you know, that you're like put up in the air in a plane, shot across the world, like shaken around, like frisked, and like, you know,
at their mercy. Yeah.
That in itself is a transit like that. But if you're not flying on that day, that you'll probably have a similar level of turbulence in your life.
Might be more subtle, but
or I mean, it could be less subtle because you're like, you wouldn't notice it because you're flying. That, you know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah.
Like you're not planning on doing anything that day, but you're frisked, like shot across the world, like, you know, thrown into the air and shaken around, you know. You'll definitely take notice.
So anything else that we must cover before we close this lovely chat?
I did have a couple just random notes. I saw that in Science News that we had the sun trining Pluto soon, and we had the Mars conjunct Pluto a couple weeks ago. And I saw the headline that says, NASA gets ready to launch the first lander to investigate Mars's insides, which is like so Mars on Pluto, You're like, Pluto is like the depths, like the absolute like unknown depths of something, and then right after the conjunction, and then leading up to then you get the vision part, like the sun trine Pluto. You're like, oh, let's see what's up with Pluto, because Mars just conjoined Pluto. And you're like, oh, now we get to look inside Mars,
Amazing.
But it won't be sending that information until next year, I think, or set up to do it. But that was, that's a recent headline that's happening. So it's going to be interesting with the sun trine Pluto in general, that because of that Mars conjunction, which if you listened last week, I was reading a lot of headlines that were really dark, and even the ones that weren't that dark had this Pluto-Mars character, like the veggie burger that bleeds.
Oh yeah.
There was just this obvious nastiness and violence kind of laced into everything.
Yeah, it was
just this dark character of the world. And now that you get the sun trine Pluto the following week, that's so a trine is the planets are 120 degrees apart. They're in the same element. The trine is from Taurus to Capricorn, so they're in each other's element. They're harmonized. So now after the conjunction of Mars and Pluto, and we're like, whoa, the world's really dark. Now the sun looks at it and says, and it's finally able to digest some of those themes, and we can now say okay, the world's really dark. What do we do about it?
Yeah.
Because the sun is all about doing stuff,
Yeah.
Which I thought was kind of interesting. It was kind of a new level of how screwed the world is.
Yeah.
Literally headlines we're doomed,
I know. I read this one brief article on inhabitat.com about how shampoo, deodorant, and lotion is contributing nearly as much urban air pollution as your daily commute.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Which, I mean, obviously we don't use stuff like that, but I love that it's coming down to that.
Yeah.
And sunscreen they're banning certain sunscreen, or lawmakers have passed it and the governor still has to sign it, but in Hawaii, the first time they're banning certain types of sunscreen as it is harming the coral reefs there.
Yeah, because you just showed me that article about the increasing dead zone in the ocean.
Yeah, that one too. I mean,
which is pretty Pluto. Pluto is almost like black hole, like a void,
Yeah, underwater robots just discovered the world's biggest dead zone, and it's off the coast of Oman. So
yeah,
there was a lot more really devastating news this week on sites that I usually go to that don't really rely on devastation for readership. Do you know what I mean?
More neutral, maybe some positive articles, some some serious
realistic
articles.
Yeah, so there were some really hard headlines and
I think
stories to read.
I think that probably has to do with being the week between the Mars-Pluto conjunction and then the sun trining Pluto, being okay, what's up with Mars conjoining you, Pluto, in the sign with both malefics in it.
This is so crazy. It says for the first time ever, all villages in India have electricity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It's a major energy milestone.
I would not expect that. Yeah, and so, I mean, of course, we've been dealing with hard environmental news for years and years, but definitely the caliber of it and the pitch of it is quickly escalating. So yeah, so we do get kind of a mini break here, unless some of you were really knocked off kilter from that Scorpio full moon, which could have been pretty poisonous. I learned a few things about what happens when there's a full moon right on top of a natal planet, or especially a planet as important as the sun, and the moon is really juiced up by the malefics. because the moon is like your body and your emotions. It can be really overwhelming and knock you off balance. So if you survived that one and you're doing okay, or either way, take this next week to kind of like gather your senses and prepare yourself for the next turbulent ride, which comes like after this coming weekend, and then try to stay on your feet as Uranus switches signs, which will be all about next week. We'll probably talk about that in depth then. So
looking forward to seeing all of you again next week.
Yeah, or at least imagining you as we talk into our microphones.
You. Yes. Thank you for listening.
Yep. Talk to you soon. Thank you for listening to Liminal Light. Our theme music was composed by the ever-talented Asa Irons. I'm your host, Chrissy Puchere Rapucci, and you can find me at atavisceral.com, atavisceral.com, where I post articles and forecasts, offer chart readings, talismanic concoctions, occult services, tarot, divination, and more.